Good morning. Welcome to day 2 of this incredible conference on the Midwest. Yesterday, I think, gave us a foretaste of yet more feasting to come. Was really pleased with the creativity, the innovation and scholarship, the insights. I learned so much about the Midwest that I did not know yesterday, and I'm looking forward to learning a lot more today. So welcome to you for the second day, and if you have any questions, for those of you who were not able to take advantage of yesterday's presentations, if you have any questions about the organization of the conference or where something is, by all means talk to Ann O'Keefe. She's our event planner at the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies, and she'll be happy to help. Ask any of us at the Hauenstein Center. I'm Gleaves Whitney, the director of the Hauenstein Center. You can talk to me. You can talk to Joe Hogan back there, or John Howard, Kathy Rent. Any of us will be happy to help you just find things or recommend if you were wondering where a good restaurant is, or good Midwestern fare. We've got a lot of it here in Grand Rapids. So at this point, I'd like to turn over the stage to my colleague Mark Steiner, who is going to chair this next committee on the Midwest's Voices.
Thank you,
Mark.
Okay, thank you. Well, before we get going on the Midwest Voices, there is a little glitch in the program because we do have 4 speakers, and our third speaker was left off the program inadvertently. It's Jim Leary, who will be the third speaker. So I'll just introduce them very quickly. We have 4 speakers. We're going to have to go through this, very, very efficiently. So here it goes. So our first speaker is Zachary Michael Jack. He's an associate professor of English at North Central College in Naperville. He teaches a variety of courses, graduate and undergraduate, a 7th generation Iowan on the same farm where he still lives in eastern Iowa. He's won several teaching and writing awards, written many books, The Midwest Farmer's Daughter, The Letters of Henry Wallace. I could go on. So he will be our first speaker. Our second speaker is Professor James Seaton, who's a professor of English at Michigan State University. He's written a number of books, most recently Literary Criticism from Plato to Postmodernism. He's the editor of The Gentile Tradition in American Philosophy and Character and Opinion in the United States by George Santayana. Boy, that's a long title, James. Anyway, I've got to gallop through this because we have 4 speakers in an hour and a half. He contributes to the Weekly Standard. He's published in the Wall Street Journal, the University Bookman, Modern Age, American Scholar, Hudson Review, a lot of publications. And I think what's very interesting, he was the winner of the Mid-American Award given by the Society for the Study of Midwestern Literature for, quote, distinguished contribution to the study of Midwestern literature. Our third speaker is the person who was left off the program, Jim O'Leary, professor of comparative literature and folklore studies and Scandinavian studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He directs the Center for the Study of Upper Midwestern Culture, published many books, among them one about Polkabilly. I think it was promoted yesterday. Ole and Lena. I mean, we could go on. Anyway, a lot of books, a lot of articles. I'm from Minnesota, and we do these Ole and Lena jokes, but that's enough there. I'm really looking forward to, and he's been a Fulbrighter in Iceland. A wonderful person. All of them are. David Pashasky. Am I saying your name right, David? Pekaski. Professor of English, Southwestern State University, Marshall, Minnesota. Author of 17 books. Amazing. He's been a 3-time Fulbrighter. He writes about Bob Dylan, Mongolia, so many things. So many awards, and I could go on. But this is our group, and I think we'd better get going because we have 4 speakers. So I present Professor Zachary Jack.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Good morning. It's nice to see all of your faces, and I think I speak for all of us when I say we really appreciate you coming out. This has been a great occasion so far, and be remiss not to thank the center and to thank John and the rest of the MHA for making this happen. Really an incredible luxury and opportunity for all of us who care about the Midwest. this is obviously, as most of the pieces you'll hear today, it's from a longer piece that's closer to 5,000 words. So I'm just going to read a little tiny bit. The larger piece is titled Of Murals and Mirrors, Midwest Regionalists Now and Then. So it's Of Murals and Mirrors. So it takes as a kind of jumping off point some recent news. I'm from eastern Iowa, where I still live. And in the news of late has been the uncovery of some public art, large-scale murals in the former federal building in Cedar Rapids. Now it's the City Hall. Now this seems like sort of local yokel news, I know, but it's a really interesting case study. This mural was painted in 1936 by Francis Robert White, who was an Iowan. He was a Grant Wood disciple, and so it was painted in 1936. It was painted over in 1951 based on a federal court order sought by a judge who found the artwork offensive. Particularly, there was a portrayal of a Wild West frontier-style lynching on the mural. There was a nude, and there was also a controversial headline painted into the mural. So, painted in 36, painted over in 51, restored, painted over again in 1963, and then now being restored again. So it sort of, I think, it shows the cycles through which we move, and it sort of obviates, I think, the need for us as local and regional historians, because it was only through the work of local and regional historians that, with very long longitudinal memories, that anyone remembered that these murals really existed. So it's a fascinating tale. I'm not going to get too much into that case study here, but that's what this talk is kind of built around. And I begin a little bit with a narrative when I'm driving home here to Iowa. It's Friday night in mid-April, and after a day of work, I am driving home to Grant Wood country. To this day, some prefer to name my home county by its famous native son, and little wonder. It's not just that Grant Wood's childhood school and stomping grounds, Antioch, are a mere 10 miles down the road from my farm, but that the rolling land I enter when I cross the Mississippi River are his hills, high and buxom and greening just as they are in the maestro's paintings. To call this place Grant Wood country is not unlike calling Iowa tall corn country, or perhaps to refer to the larger region in which it resides as the Corn Belt. We name ourselves here for homegrown crops. For the homegrown crops of which we are most proud, whether they are human or vegetable. A half dozen miles down the road from Antioch School, Grant Wood's grave sits on a high hill above the Wapsipinicon River in Anamosa, Iowa. And a few more miles upriver, a few more miles upriver of his grave is the site of Wood's regionally famous art colony at Stone City. There, the maestro's personal gravitas and magnetic appeal drew other prominent regionalists in 1932 and 1933, including poet-playwright J. Sigmund, painter Marvin Cohn, writer-professor Paul Engel, and muralists John Bloom and Francis Robert White. The nearness of these important regionalist sites, sacred temples really, if we as regionalist historians possess a pilgrim's soul, is not at all accidental. If you include nearby Cedar Rapids, site of Grant Wood's studio, and Iowa City, where for a time he lived and taught, the near entirety of Wood's life is contained within this 30-mile radius. It's clear the artist lived out his place-based creed, which roughly translates to the old agrarian maxim, "You dance with the ones that brung you." We might ask the same of ourselves, we regionalist historians and boosters and advocate critics. Are the sacred pilgrim sites in our personal pantheon and professional lives as near to us now as Wood insisted his remain to him throughout his life? And if not, why not? We claim to admire these founding regionalists, or at least appreciate them, but why then do we find it so hard to live by their example? How near to where you now live and work is the locus of your own personal history? Your first school, first date, first kiss, first poem or paper or painting judged good and worthy? Or is it that economic necessity or marital compromise required us to leave our homeland and our rooted history behind? And if so, is it fair to claim that modern-day economic imperatives forced us to become migrant scholars? After all, Wood and Sigmund and Engel and others made their difficult decisions to stay at home during the height of the Great Depression. Regionalism, as conventionally defined, comes with a kind of unavoidable slings and arrows. We postmoderns find uncomfortable, if not outright judgmental. As a philosophy as well as an aesthetic, it dares to ask something of us, namely that we vote with our feet, living in and otherwise helping to sustain the place from which we harvest our inspiration and our scholarship. At times, I'll admit, I too find the regionalist standard set by Wood and company hard to achieve. Often I am anxious that I fall short. And like you, no doubt, I fear living in the proverbial glass house. And yet I do strive to make regionalism a lived rather than merely academic enterprise. While I study the movement historically, sometimes hundreds of miles away in dusty repositories and late at night in digital archives, such encounters leave me cold, except when they are coupled with a lived life. And more so each year I hang my hat and grind my axe at home in Grant Wood country. And I do hang my hat and swing my axe here. The language is closer to parable than metaphor or analogy. On this day, as on many others, my professional journey is a long one, taking me into neighboring Illinois. Still, I am close enough to tune in the hometown radio station in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, WMT, the so-called farmers' radio station, and one of a few remaining to cover agricultural news. For a brief moment on this April afternoon, temperatures top 80, and the news director and his good-natured sidekick are agog with the preternatural numbers, though they are not quite record highs for this date in history, as the saying goes. Like so many things, indeed like regionalism itself, weather, like history, is equal parts now and then. Historical averages, yes, on the one side, but current conditions mixing and mingling to form a forecast. The past becomes the present, becomes predictive. Where and when historical study lingers in the then at the expense of the now, I argue it turns negligent, irrelevant to the public at large, and inept at doing the very thing a region's demos would have it do: look backward and forward simultaneously as it reads the auspices, like the goddess Janus pictured on Roman coins and temples, looking into the future and the past all at once. I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit here. I think I'll skip past the part about the murals that I was describing in Cedar Rapids, as well as the development that's going on in what's called New Bohemia in Cedar Rapids, which is a kind of regionalist resurgence. The difficult questions regionalists asked in the 1930s are more relevant now than ever. And one of the movement's most profound questions is this: what exactly does the contemporary historian, be they literary, cultural, social, political, or otherwise, owe to locality? In his essay, The Rootless Professors, academic Eric Zensi criticizes a world where, quote, professors owe no allegiance to geographical territory, unquote, and are instead expected to belong to, quote, the boundless world of books and eternal truths, not the infinitely particular world of watersheds, growing seasons, and ecological niches, unquote. He both fingers and faults an academic community where nativity and locality actually hurt an applicant's prospects for tenure-track employment. The question begs asking then, do nativity and locality likewise disadvantage the reputation of the native historian? At breakfast, we were talking about this. To what degree do we actually honor and respect the work of history buffs, of amateur historians, local historians. I think we could agree in this room, not nearly enough. In pointing to the complexity of watersheds, of moving waters, Zenzi means to suggest, I think, that there are certain intricacies and vagaries that can only be adequately understood by those who live them. We tend to equate childhood spent in this or that Midwestern place with lifelong membership and credential and therefore insight. But consider for a moment the water under the bridge the historian misses when she spends her adult life away from her region of study. Here's a homespun example of the difference between childhood claim and lived lineage. In the back of my farm runs a creek so out of the way and forgotten it bears no name. It is, in fact, absent from nearly every map, whether township, state, or county, to which I have been historically privy. I am not native to this one particular creek, though I did grow up in its larger watershed. Lynn, my neighbor in town who delivers the propane, did grow up on this creek. He knows its yesteryears, its history. And in coupling my day-to-day living alongside it in the present with his childhood recollections, I have come, I think, to know the creek in its full width and breadth. And though scarcely 40 years have passed since Lynn ran its banks as a boy, it is not the same creek an out-migrating historian would remember. Lynn's creek ran dry a good part of every summer and fall, so dry that a boy was hard-pressed to find water to splash in. Whereas my creek of the now often rages and produces floodwaters sufficient to crest its 10-foot-high banks. It is the same creek in name only. Most Midwestern historians would agree that an acute interest in our region is a prerequisite or a pre-qualifier for the moniker Midwestern historian. Yet strangely many would question the desirability, let alone sagacity, of insisting or even recommending that a historian live in the region he or she studies. We understand, for example, that in headquartering his art colony roughly 3 miles outside his hometown of Anamosa, Iowa, Grant Wood attempted to live out his ism. Similarly, we understand it as perfectly apropos that a conference entitled Rediscovering the Lost Region would be held in Michigan. How many of us would have balked or at least chuckled darkly at the irony had this gathering of luminaries been hosted in New Orleans, say, or Los Angeles, or Yazoo, Mississippi? Pressing the logic one step further, as no doubt Wood and his fellow Stone City colonists would have done, is it fair to call the question, is devoting a life of study to a place without living there a fair portion of every year any more or less justifiable than the irony of holding a Midwestern summit in, for example, Miami? Of course, the out-migrating historian would quickly and perhaps a bit defensively point out that the past, too, is a place we could never visit, never actually live in, and yet somehow, via the magic of methodology and book learning, we are led to believe it can be interpreted accurately and well. On the contrary, I would suggest that the historian living her now in the region she studies better understands her region's thens, since the intermingling and overlapping of thens and nows is bedrock in historical study. In the hands of the rooted rather than rootless historian, historical study becomes analogous to caretaking. Here, once more, we tread on sensitive ground, implying by analogy and for example, that the sibling who flew the coop can't be of use when a family elder needs them back home. They can make phone calls and do. They can arrange, negotiate, and research at a distance. But their absence from the scene means there are certain presumptions to firsthand experience and awareness and longitudinal memory, which is to say history, that they simply cannot make. The way a native looks at the art or literature of his or her region offers perhaps another case study. For example, the native historian who looks intently at Grant Wood's painting Young Corn would know that Wood's Mammarian hills are not hyperbole. They're not put on, they're not trompe-l'oeil, but instead they're representative of real topography in his native Wapsipinicon Valley at the southern edge of the driftless area. From experience, the truly native historian would be able to date the scenes shown in the painting to perhaps late May or early June. The new corn up, the first cut of hay drying in windrows, the elm and ash maple and oaks in full leaf. She would feel the bright sun on her face. She, the native historian, would feel the bright sun on her face and hands at the same or similar longitude and latitude as the farmer in the canvas. And in turn, the native painter, Grant Wood, who painted the farmer in the canvas. To the degree that history may be sensed or actually felt, as much as merely recorded and later interpreted, the truly native historian could perhaps feel it better than virtually anyone else. Is history an ecology? Is it an applied science? Is it a field science? Is it a fine art? And if it be any or all of these, is it possible to imagine it removed of locality of practice any more than we could imagine the weatherman at the local radio station not waking up to scoop the same snow as his viewers each morning? Or the ecologist attempting to study a native prairie species without herself becoming, in some real, on-the-ground way, native to that prairie? Thank you for listening. Thanks. Thanks again.
Like all the other speakers, I'd say it's a great honor to appear at this conference and a great pleasure, and I thank everybody connected with it. The term Midwest intellectual, some people, the coasties, to use a term Deirdre McCloskey might consider an oxymoron. So what I'm going to explore here, I'm going to take an example of 4 Midwest intellectuals. Kenneth Rexroth, poet and critic, gained attention as a leader of the San Francisco contingent of the Beat generation. Russell Kirk became famous with the publication of The Conservative Mind in 1953. The book's emphasis on Edmund Burke and other English thinkers, its near silence about such Central American political figures as James Madison and Abraham Lincoln, and its respectful attitude toward the antebellum Southern conservatism of John Calhoun, suggested to many readers that its author found little worth conserving in 20th century America. For about 15 years, from the middle 60s through the 70s, Christopher Lasch, historian and social critic, was one of the most frequent and influential contributors to the New York Review of Books, writing on such hot-button topics as Black Power, the possibilities of socialism in America, and one of the titles, Emancipated Women. Deirdre McCloskey is probably best known to non-economists as the author of Crossing, a memoir describing her transition from male to female. Well, at first glance, there's nothing particularly Midwestern about any of these figures, although they were all born in the Midwest, at least if one associates the Midwest in culture with an adherence to traditional morality, in politics with a patriotism that, while not uncritical, sees the United States as a force, all things considered, for good, and in economics with an acceptance of capitalism, either because the alternatives seem worse or because the system of, quoting here, free labor, italicized, free labor, is the just and generous and prosperous system which opens the way for all, as Abraham Lincoln put it in his 1859 address to the Wisconsin State Agricultural Society. Yet the Midwest left its mark on all 4, one that is all the more significant because the public image of each has seemed at times to represent, at least to casual observers, the antithesis of supposedly Midwestern values. Kenneth Rexroth, as I said, was one of the leading figures in what has been called the San Francisco Renaissance, or the West Coast Beat generation. Rexroth's essays are filled with declarations condemning almost every aspect of contemporary culture, society, and politics. Rexroth writes that one, quote, cannot be forgiven for being a parson or a social worker or a professor, unquote, because these occupations make one part of the social lie capitalized, and a partner in mass murder. 1950s America was nothing more to Rexroth than the mindless cacodemon called Things as They Are. Yet when Rexroth came to write his autobiography, he revealed that all along he had been not a revolutionary and certainly not a Marxist, but instead a conservationist, if not a conservative, unquote. He had learned his values not from the denizens of Greenwich Village or Haight-Ashbury, but instead in Indiana and Michigan from his parents. The misunderstanding was understandable since, as Rexroth explained, quoting, "In an atomized mass culture, a life motivated by inherited standards may well seem eccentric and revolutionary," unquote. It was not only his parents, but the diverse cast of Midwesterners around whom he grew up in the early 1900s that shaped his character. And here's a quotation again. "Schwenkfelders, Mennonites, German revolutionaries of '48, abolitionists, suffragists, squaws and Indian traders, octoroons and itinerant horse dealers, farmers in broad hats, full beards, and frogged coats, hard-drinking small-town speculators, all have gone to make a personality that has proved highly resistant to digestion by the mass culture, and yet, I think, conservative of the characteristic values of American life rather than the reverse," unquote. And more than 30 years after his death, it is Rexroth, the cultural conservative, the author of many essays affirming the permanent value of the great books in works like Classics Revisited, who is remembered and read, not Rexroth, the supposed godfather of beat poets like Allen Ginsberg and Gregory Corso. Well, a reader of the first editions of Russell Kirk's The Conservative Mind, subtitled From Burke to Santayana, could be forgiven for suspecting that Kirk's indictment of the modern world, and a fortiori, the United States, was at least as severe as those issued by Kenneth Rexroth, the radical. Kirk's grounds for condemnation were not identical to those offered by Rexroth, but they were not entirely different either. Certainly, both were all-encompassing. Kirk found himself confronting, quote, "a world that damns tradition, exalts equality, and welcomes change, a world that has clutched at Rousseau, swallowed him whole, and demanded profits yet more radical, a world smudged by industrialism, standardized by the masses, consolidated by government, a world crippled by war, trembling between the colossi of East and West, and peering over a smashed barricade into the gulf of disillusion." Henry Regnery, the book's publisher, reports that Kirk's first choice for a title was The Conservative Root. To be a conservative in America, the book seemed to suggest, was to be doomed to failure. Kirk calls the Adams family, John Adams, John Quincy, and later Henry and Brooks Adams, as witnesses to the hostility of American culture to intellectual distinction and conservative ideas. Meanwhile, George Santayana, the final spokesman for conservatism in the first edition, had expressed his view of American society by leaving Harvard and the United States, never to return as soon as he had the money to do so. Later, however, Russell Kirk qualified, altered, and deepened his view of the United States, so much so that in his true magnum opus, The Roots of American Order, American society no longer appears as merely the leading edge of a destructive modernism, but instead as a society that has achieved, at the very least, a tolerable order that should arouse not despair, but appreciation. Abraham Lincoln, scarcely mentioned in The Conservative Mind, now receives his due as a conservative in the highest sense. For the Kirk of The Roots of American Order, the example of Lincoln, quote, "proved that a democracy of elevation can uphold resolutely the public order and the moral order." The United States that Lincoln did so much to preserve and enrich now seems an exceptional nation, one that has been spared the afflictions, moral and material, that have ravaged so many other nations. Kirk declares that, quoting, "anyone who appreciates the legacy of moral and social order which he has inherited in America will feel gratitude," unquote. He finds reasons to declare, quoting again, "the American order a conspicuous success in the perspective of human history. While Christopher Lasch would have disputed such a positive appraisal in his earlier books because the country was perversely unwilling to welcome a socialist revolution, but in his later works, because of the dominance in America of, I'm going to quote from his last work, a liberalism obsessed with the rights of women and minorities, with gay rights and unlimited abortion rights, with the allegedly epidemic spread of child abuse and sexual harassment, with the need for regulations against offensive speech, and with curricular reforms designed to end the cultural hegemony of dead white European males, unquote. Lasch was always a critic of liberalism, but in his earlier works he critiqued it from the left, while in the later he spoke on behalf of a petit bourgeois populism, a petit bourgeois populism whose adherents resisted the cultural radicalism of what Lasch calls their self-appointed spokesmen and would-be liberators among the elites. Cultural conservatism, Lasch observes, is the worldview not of the rich and famous, but of the classes for whom the left claims to speak. Quote, "It is the working and lower middle classes, after all, that favor limits on abortion, cling to the two-parent family as a source of stability in a turbulent world, resist experiments with alternative lifestyles, and harbor deep reservations about affirmative action and other ventures in large-scale social engineering." In his last works before his untimely death in 1994, Lasch became an unabashed spokesman for the citizenry of the real middle America. Lasch declared that they understand, as their betters do not, that there are inherent limits on human control over the course of social development, over nature and the body, over the tragic elements in human history and life, unquote. For Lasch, the caricature spread by the media and the academy reveals more about the worldview of academic and corporate elites than about the people it allegedly describes. Quoting, "In the United States, middle America, a term that has both geographical and social implications, has come to stand everything that stands in the way of progress, family values, mindless patriotism, religious fundamentalism, fascism, homophobia, retrograde views of women. Middle Americans, as they appear to the makers of educated opinion, are hopelessly shabby, unfashionable, and provincial, ill-informed about changes in taste or intellectual trends, addicted to trashy novels of romance and adventure, all stupefied by prolonged exposure to television," unquote. Well, Lasch's journey from the far left to a defense of middle America was reluctant and slow. On the way, he lost favor with the academic and cultural elites whose worldview was expressed by the New York Review of Books, where he found himself no longer welcome. Yet Lasch's most meaningful legacy, the cultural, political, and moral critique carried out in books like The True and Only Haven in a Heartless World, The Minimal Self, and The Revolt of the Elites, remain valuable decades after the notion that socialist revolution could be the solution to Americans' problems has imploded. Deirdre McCloskey, formerly Donald McCloskey, is best known to the general public as the author of Crossing, a memoir which describes her transition in middle age from man to woman. Spokespeople for the transgendered often condemn capitalism, traditional culture, and especially traditional religion as patriarchal and bigoted. Deirdre McCloskey, however, while adamantly defending her decision to cross, to use her word, has written a series of magisterial works not only defending capitalism, but defending it on the grounds of traditional morality. To leftists of all stripes, avant-garde artists, neo-Confederates, and to many of the self-appointed leaders of the LGBT community, bourgeois is a dirty word. Deirdre McCloskey thinks otherwise. She argues, quoting from her book called Bourgeois Dignity, "The dual ethical change of dignity and of liberty for ordinary bourgeois life has led to a reign of sense and sensibility from which we are all still benefiting. Its virtues are commercial prudence and family love, combined in the self-defined middle class with an almost insane inventive courage fueled by hope, protected in its politics by faith and temperance." Kenneth Rexroth, Russell Kirk, Christopher Lasch, and Deirdre McCloskey are Midwest intellectuals, not because they are regional chauvinists, and not because they have been unwilling to search for the true, the good, and the beautiful wherever in the world those elusive entities may be found. They are Midwestern intellectuals because all four, despite sometimes long detours sampling other views of the world, came to affirm and deepen characteristic Midwestern values. In culture, traditional morality. In economics, the system of free labor, AKA capitalism. And in politics, a patriotism that, while not uncritical, sees the United States as a force, all things considered, for good. Thank you.
Oops. Okay. I'll just join the chorus of thanking John and also the organizers here at the center. I'm very glad to be here. My topic is a huge one, Midwestern musicians. Midwestern musicians, the performers of real homegrown grassroots folk vernacular stuff, were no mystery to me as a kid growing up in northwestern Wisconsin in the 1950s. They were evident in Ham's beer commercials, broadcast on Twin Cities television, and in Scandinavian dialect songs spun seasonally on local radio. Ham's ads featured a prominent rhythm inspired by woodland Indian powwow drumming, vocals that leapt from bass register to an echoing yodel-like falsetto, a cartoon bear alternately burling like a lumberjack on a beaver-gnawed timber or bowling on ice like a stout Dutchman, and environmentally evocative lyrics from the land of sky blue waters, from the land of pines, lofty balsams comes the beer refreshing Hams, the beer refreshing. The beer refreshing refrain resonated with other familiar regional slogans like Schmidt's brew that grew with the great Northwest and Schlitz's beer that made Milwaukee famous, and also with a pair of the era's most popular polka songs, Roll Out the Barrel and In Heaven There Is No Beer. Meanwhile, comic Scandinavian dialect ditties performed theatrically in approximation of the broken English of immigrant Norwegians and Swedes were winter standards, whether invoking the whistling, drifting snow or rendering jingle bells as jingle bells. They conveyed the tribulations of the coldest Swede in the whole darn Middle West. Yingling Scandinavian songs and Ham's cartoon jingles considered together condensed key elements of my regional reality more than any other music. My childhood home was set between a woods, a swamp, and two lakes where pines swayed, waters sparkled, and bears sometimes roamed. Winters were long, dark, snowy affairs requiring sociability, and there were scores of bars and a few bowling alleys in and around Rice Lake, Wisconsin. These sights, scenes, and seasons also had discrete local musicians. Venturing north to the La Coudray Reservation for an occasional community or historical event, I heard Ojibwe dance drums. Meanwhile, Rinlesbacher's friendly Buckhorn Bar Cafe, its back wall festooned with the world's largest collection of odd lumberjack musical instruments, was a hangout for wool-clad former timber beasts. Perched on a hill east of town, WJMC Radio broadcast live performances by area groups that included Bohemian, German, Scandinavian polka bands, a Polish barn dance, and occasional Sunday afternoon interludes with Swiss yodelers. These are cheesemakers up in my neck of the woods. Despite not being overtly regional in their origins and song lyrics, these musicians all contributed to a collective upper Midwestern soundscape as inescapable as wind through the pines and waves against the shores. my retrospective regionally grounded sonic experiences may or may not resemble those of other upper Midwesterners, and they surely differ in fundamental ways from those folks raised in the region's central and lower realms. For example, from Knox County, Ohio, the Irish-American Dan Emmett met up with the Free Blacks, the Snowden family. Emmett went on, he was a pioneer in blackface minstrelsy, but it showed a lot of interaction between blacks, Irish, and also Germans along the Ohio River in the 19th century. In the 21st century, in my 7th decade, I now regard Midwestern musicians conceptually as amorphous and elusive. And yet we can encounter quintessential regional performers by focusing on Chicago, a destination and a crossroads at the Midwest Center. Did I leave my other pages behind? Sorry. Can't do that. Okay. So I want to look at it during a crucial formative era from the late 19th through the mid-20th centuries. Chicago as Midwestern musicians' nexus is most evident in key historical moments, movements, and infrastructures featuring public performances, staging, publishing, recording, broadcasting, and the dissemination of regionally grounded, evolving, and intermingling folk and vernacular genres. So in the time remaining, I'm going to briefly mention exemplary and unknown notable musicians and bombard you with images before closing with a couple of synthetic observations. So I really want to kind of set up the infrastructure that helped to sustain a diversity of regionally grounded music. And so if we look, certainly a profusion of ethnic halls or that corresponded in some ways also with Grange halls in rural areas. This is a Finnish hall, a site for performance and performing groups. The Settlement House movement, Jane Addams founded in the late 1870s, sponsored a lot of culture shows by various immigrant groups and later by rural newcomers to the city. You can see music by the brass band and dancing and so forth. Certainly various labor movements, assorted unions had festivals, processions, and people like Emma Goldman, of course, said, if I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution. So we have this vital working class movement going on. Some opposition, of course, from the WASP powers that be, dance halls and working class taverns. The site of music and song and dancing were also deemed by some to be places where white slavery was practiced, and so assorted temperance movements and blue laws also correlated with anti-labor initiatives and also anti-ethnic or xenophobia in the late 19th and early 20th century. But at the same time that some of the powers that be, certainly in Chicago, were trying to put down or control the unruly musical pluralism of people there, the official culture was also, unbeknownst, fostering that very thing through a number of events, including World's Fairs and also out in the hinterlands. Chautauqua tied in with vaudeville in the cities, and there were a number of fiddler contests and folk festivals that went on in Chicago. The Columbian Exposition of 1893 has been invoked. Of course, it showcased progress. It had that horrible architecture that Mike reminded us of Frank Lloyd Wright was complaining about. But it also had a number of so-called human zoos, including American Indians from the region, but a lot of interesting stuff going on. There was a German village, over 1 million visitors, had a bunch of musicians from Germany. There were Swiss yodelers and Alphorn players from the Alps, but there were also Swiss and German communities in large measure in Chicago, and a lot of interaction. One of the people who was involved with the World's Fair was an immigrant from Saxony, Otto Georgi, who's seen on the upper right. He came from the area around Chemnitzer, where they had invented the German concertina. He was a merchant for that, and through his musicianship, his publishing house, and his promotion, he fostered the proliferation of the concertina through the region, became the mainstay in a number of polka styles. You see Whoopie John, Hans Wilfart from New Ulm, who later recorded in Chicago, playing the concertina, and of course it became also the main instrument in the Chicago-based honky and dino Polish polka sounds. There was also a prominent Irish village, brought over people from Ireland, but there was a huge Irish American population in Chicago. We can see here pipers, jigs, cakes and ale features. Down below the piper, Charles McSweeney from Donegal, but over on the right there is also another piper mentioned, a guy named Murphy. Murphy, this is Blind Murphy, mentioned by Captain Francis O'Neill, an immigrant from Ireland who rose to be head of the chief of police in Chicago. But he was an Irish musician in his spare time. He actually recruited pipers and musicians into the Chicago police force and even recorded tunes from them as well as from prisoners in the Chicago jails. And while a lot of traditional music in Ireland was being kind of forgotten or suppressed by the British and by pietistic movements among the Catholic Church, O'Neill was setting down Irish tunes so that his book, published in the early 20th century, became the standard source for lost tunes among Irish and Irish-American musicians. One of his colleagues in Chicago was Patsy Toohey, the most eminent Ullin pipe player of his generation, whose tunes are still emulated from old cylinder recordings. And at the Chicago World's Fair, there was a contingent of Michigan lumberjacks who ate and slept and hung out in their camp on the mall. And as we know from the work of Franz Rickaby a little bit later, as he said, the hegemony in song and dance in the lumber camps belongs to the Irish. And I like to think there was a lot of interaction between the Irish contingent, the Irish American in Chicago, and the Irish lumberjacks. Returning as freaks, according to the racist and xenophobic Chicago Tribune, we have Ho-Chunk, known as Winnebago then, and Potawatomi people coming to Chicago, where down at the bottom it says the Braves and Squaws will give a daily presentation of famous ghost and war dances, and they have an old bass drum. This was shortly after the Lakota woman, tail feather woman, had a vision of a big drum, which had not existed among Native people. The Lakota people began to give it ceremonially to Ojibwe and Menominee, and by the late 19th century, the prototype of the powwow drum, the big drum, had spread. It was set up here in Chicago, and the powwows also drew on Buffalo Bill Wild West shows and a number of other presentation modes, and they were there at the World's Fair. Meanwhile, out in the hinterlands, of course, inspired by Chautauqua, New York, but emerging in Iowa, a tent show version of Chautauqua, also tied in with the vaudeville circuit, and it allowed a lot of performers, musically diverse performers, to play in urban and rural areas, with Chicago as kind of a hub, but going out in the hinterlands. Among them were these Croatian musicians, the Iliash Tamburitsins, who toured all around the region, giving culture shows, going to Croatian communities in the Iron Range of Minnesota and other places, but also introducing this music out into the hinterlands and creating a consciousness for a kind of musical pluralism. And the same thing happened in small-town vaudeville stages. A guy named Ben Holmes, who took on the character of Happy Heine, a kind of stage Dutch performer, would sing songs in kind of Germanic broken English, and really, spread this kind of music around, especially in German American communities throughout the Midwest. In 1926, Henry Ford, racist and anti-Semitic, in inclination, was convinced that jazz was destroying civilization as we know it, and he thought the antidote was old-time fiddlers contests. So through his 4 dealerships, a lot of these happened around the region. On the right is one from my hometown, Rice Lake, Wisconsin. The winner, actually, of the Chicago Herald-Examiner Midwest Fiddle Contest was Lazine Brousseau on the right, a French-Canadian from Rhinelander, Wisconsin, seen here with his trophy and a WLS microphone. I'll say a little bit more about him in a moment. But leading up to that, or in the aftermath of that, and sort of echoing the Columbian Exposition, the Century of Progress in Chicago, and of course these centuries of progress, as Zach was suggesting, you're always looking forward, but also looking back. And so, of course, it brought indigenous people again who were already in Chicago. But by 1933, indigenous people around the region had been regularly giving powwows in Wisconsin Dells. They'd been putting on culture shows with the Ho-Chunk and other native peoples from the region and beyond. This was a destination for Chicagoans. An ad from the Chicago Tribune. It says, come up to the Dells, take an exciting boat trip, but land of a million years ago. See authentic Indian ceremonial dances, feathered copper country chieftains, spear-waving warriors, beaded squaws, grinning papooses, all this horrible language from 1933. And again, weird dances and rites enthrall visitors at the Chicago World's Fair. On the bottom right, listen to the steady, even throb of the drums. So this kind of music is resonating in the hinterlands, in Chicago, around the region, and it's part of a revitalization of American Indian music by woodland peoples. Other stuff is going on at the Columbian Exposition. Bottom right, you see a kind of a representation of, well, actually what the German village looked like, and then this upper left, this fanciful characterization. You had a bunch of singing waiters in the Rathskeller at the Century of Progress with zither and button accordion, wearing lederhosen, singing assorted songs. And a lot of these people were Chicagoans. Some of them were immigrants, recent immigrants, the children of immigrants. One of them, one of the other performers there, the son of Bavarian immigrant grocers from Davenport, was a guy who called himself Herr Louis. He had begun to do radio programs with his partner, the Weasel or Weaselus, and they were very popular. Also at the Century of Progress, the Swiss Village, the Moser brothers, who recorded for Victor and played all around Swiss communities in the upper Midwest. On the right, they had also broadcast as early as 1926 on WGN radio. Present there as well were Irish. Pat Roach in the Irish Village, an immigrant from Mayo, led a dance troupe. And a couple of years later, in 1937, the National Folk Festival was held in Chicago with a lot of diverse performers from around the region. Two of these guys I knew on the bottom, Otto Rindlisbacher and Ray Calkins from my home area in northern Wisconsin. They put on a kind of a culturally diverse lumberjack show doing Swiss, Norwegian, Swedish, French, Canadian, Anglo-American music, and many Chicago-based performers were there. Potawatomi and Winnebago Indians, members of the Westphalia Bund of Chicago, a German square dance, a Winnetka square dance group, Lithuanian performers, Irish musicians and dancers, Pat Roach. You can see on the top Bob Flatley, I think the father or grandfather of Michael Flatley, the All-Ireland dance champion who was the prominent dancer in River Dance, a Chicago-based performer. Swedish musicians from Chicago, Norwegian, Polish. The Negro Spiritual Chorus is rather amazing. Three of the most extraordinary Chicago-based gospel music performers, Roberta Martin, Sally Martin, and Thomas A. Dorsey, are in that particular lineup at the National Folk Festival. Okay, so I've looked at these kinds of events happening in Chicago, fostering musical pluralism and tying in with the region, involving musicians from round about. And of course, there were also ways to reach out from Chicago through publishing, through recording, and through radio. And very briefly, people like Otto Georgi teamed up with a guy, Louis Vitak, and later Vitak teamed with Elsnik. They put out a lot of sheet music for especially Czech and, mostly Czech. Another guy, Patik, began to manufacture and market concertinas around the region and to perform on 78 RPM records. Eric Olsen put out a number of Scandinavian tune books, this one a pan-Scandinavian one. The WLS radio station also had a weekly program guide as well as an annual. And of course the Black Migration, the Great Migration, beginning with World War I, by the early 1920s had a very strong presence in terms of recording. J. Mayo Williams, who had been an artist and repertoire man for Paramount Records, based in Port Washington, Wisconsin, in 1922, set up his own African-American label, the first African-American label, Black Patty, based in Chicago. And lots of remarkable performers were either in Chicago or came there during that period. From the left, Big Bill Brunzi, the astonishing guitar player and gospel singer, Rosetta Tharpe. On the top, Thomas A. Dorsey, who kind of shifted from ragtime to be kind of the founder of modern gospel with tunes like Precious Lord. And down below, he's been mentioned before, Louis Armstrong, and then seated King Oliver. And Armstrong came up to join King Oliver's band in the early 1920s. One of the earliest record labels was a Swedish label. 5 minutes? Oh, I'm out. Okay. Record labels, Polish, WLS, radio. Don't have a lot of time here. There's astonishing post-World War II labels, amazing performers like Muddy Waters and Little Wally, who took down-home music and gave it a lot of energy and dynamism in the urban setting. And so just music is culturally plural, fluid, creolized, it's regionally rooted. It extends a whole lot of different kinds of traditions, but there's, in addition to Anglo-Afro, there's this woodland Indian, European stuff, and it's evident in lots of different genres we find in the region. So, thank you. Okay.
Am I on? Yes? Okay, thank you, everyone. I'll give you the short version. I did print out copies of the long version, so if you want, I can give you a copy with bibliographies. I was going to talk about writers, Midwest writing, big topic. For the talk, mostly ideas and a few books. I'd say the Midwest has always had its share of writers, so we've never been lost, except in the national consciousness and in our own consciousness to the degree that we subscribe to the national agenda, right? So that's the tricky part, right? But the different waves maybe suggest ways we can take to resurrect it. And obviously early on, the West was marketable as the other, with mystery and danger and adventure. Carolyn Kirkland writing about a new home, Huck and Jim floating down the Mississippi, giants in the earth, oh pioneers, Little House on the Prairie. Then a second wave, when the Midwest, as somebody else yesterday quoted somebody saying, it becomes America. It becomes corporate capitalist America in Frank Norris and Theodore Dreiser and The Jungle. it becomes small-town America, you know, in Spoon River and Weinsberg and Friendship Village. Actually, H.L. Mencken wrote in a 1920 essay for the Smart Set, draw a circle of 200 miles radius around Chicago, and you will enclose 4/5 of the real literature of America. That was 1920. That was the year that Sinclair Lewis made Gopher Prairie the center of national attention here. That's the rise of realism in American literature, and it dovetails very nicely with our Midwestern place. Modernism and postmodernism tend to disconnect from place. What is said is less important than how it's said. And, you know, reality, we just invent that stuff. So as place becomes less important, the Midwest loses its currency, I think following the Great Depression. It's a big generalization. Writers continue to write about the Midwest. And so that in 1967, Northern Illinois Press could publish Lucian Strike's Heartland Poets of the Midwest. But of all his poets, only one of those guys gets into the Norton Anthology of American Literature, right? So you're not there. I see a revival of interest in the Midwest in the 1980s with Garrison Keillor and Robert Bly, Louise Erdrich, Jane Smiley. A lot of the writers, I'm a book guy, so I will hold up books here. But a lot of them I tracked in late harvest. And there's another thing going on. I mentioned it, a rural lit rally. And he's trying to, in Buena Vista, Ohio, resurrect some of the writers that got left off. I brought some of these flyers if you're interested in them. But in late harvest, I did some of that, and then I did a book, Rooted, 7 Midwest Writers of Place, and I just analyzed 7 of those writers from around the 70s and the 80s. And it was kind of important. It was a national series of ads, Ray Carver, called Alliance, Illinois. Hands down the most impressive long work of poetry I've read in years. So they were reading about Alliance, Illinois. And I remember, I was part of that. There was just like a hurricane of energy going on there. There were writers groups, there were reading circuits, workshops, conferences, magazines, journals. The Society for the Study of Midwestern Literature got going with Mid-America. A lot of university presses, smaller university presses. I had my own Spoon River Poetry Press, Ellis Press. We did about 150 titles now to date, some very small, some very big. Minnesota had an actual independent publishers association to take small press books around Minnesota. Illinois had the Illinois ILPA, Illinois Literary Press Association, to take books around the state of Illinois. Minnesota did a book bus, and they would drive around there. There was a lot of grant support for those things, and applications were simpler then, and we got that. The momentum carried us in writing and scholarship, I think, into the 90s, but I definitely see a slowing down of interest in the Midwest. America goes kind of global, and it goes kind of culturally diverse, and they don't, of course, count us as culturally diverse, right? And that, as I see it, that movement was energized by mostly New York and California, the places where Americans change planes when they're going to Europe and Asia. The textbooks changed their focus dramatically too. Illinois Writers Incorporated dies, 86. The Midwestern Book Fair folds. Illinois Quarterly is gone. Western Illinois Regional Studies gone. Old Northwest gone. So the switch, Counselor called this the geography of nowhere. America's switch to the geography of nowhere, I think, hurts the Midwest. I asked one of my former students, Angela Arvidsson, she reviews juveniles, how many books that you're reading now are set in the Midwest? And she said, so few that I can't think of any of them. I asked writer-publisher friends for nominations for the paper, and they were kind of hard-pressed. Bart Sutter said, most of the talented young writers I know are not much interested in our region. Minnesota Book Awards for 2015 went to books that were set in London and the state of Washington and Jamaica, and one book, set in Minnesota. On the other hand, there are writers alive and well in the Midwest. I see a Midwestern Book Festival for Chicago in 2015. I see Volume 2 of the Dictionary of Midwestern Literature forthcoming. Nebraska Book Festival was held last week. South Dakota Book Festival annually. Great River survived. Midwest Quarterly survives. Ohioana Quarterly, a number of them survive. We're inventing new journals, both literature and history. There are some older small presses that are doing the job. Jim Perlman at Holy Cow, Scott Walker with Red Dragonfly Press, a lot of them, so I'm hearing that. I'm kind of oblivious to what's going on east of Chicago, and part of this is my fault. I took off too and went to Poland and Mongolia and Latvia, so what can I say? But there is some stuff going on. William Kent Kruger has actually made a career out of pocketbook novels that are set in Minnesota. Lots of them. Leif Enger got national attention for a novel, Peace Like a River, about a family named Land, and they live in Minnesota in the country. Marshall Library, where I live, has a Read Local program going on, and a lot of new authors who have published books already. The Lake Regions, just north of Marshall, where I am, has now a Lake Region Writers Network doing their own little booklets here. Josh Preston, this is an interesting thing. He emailed me, he's from Illinois, he's on a postdoc in Stanford College, and he sent me some books. He says, everybody here in my cohort is tied to a place. And I thought that's kind of interesting. So I brought some of those along with me too. I was very interested in Charles Baxter's comment to John in the interview. Quote, in the shadow of people like Donald Bartlemay, I wrote a number of failed novels which had nothing to do with the areas of the country I grew up in. Then I thought, well, I'll try writing about the areas that I actually know. So maybe we are past postmodernism. I don't know. The paradigm is, you go out from your place into postmodernism, but then you come back, right? That's the paradigm. So maybe we'll come back. Dana Yost did a book called The Right Place, The Right Place. So what strategies can we adopt for reclaiming our place, okay? Maybe the most crucial thing, and I can't talk to that, is getting our region's history and literature back into the curricula of the schools. And where I teach at Southwest State, that has just been killed. But Paul Theobald with the Rural Lit Rally is trying to do something about that. But beyond that, I see 4 issues: aesthetics, finances, content, media. So on content, I would agree with some of my colleagues. We need to define Midwest writing as writing in a Midwest tradition. It's not just by people who come into creative writing programs and take their salaries from the Midwest and write about whatever. I once called them the pigeons of Buchenau in a story. They fly in, they pick up all the corn, and they leave us nothing but shit in return. So I'm not interested in that. A real Midwest writer understands the region, writes about the region with accurate markers of place. We need accurate markers of place, the language of the Midwest, and the thought and behavioral patterns of the Midwest, which of course are open to discussion. Maybe talk about that later. We could play to whatever the current enthusiasm is. Okay, everybody's postmodernist. William Gass was very postmodernist in his essay, In the Heart of the Country. He's a good Midwest writer, so be like William Gass. They like wackos, okay? Sell them eccentrics. David Rhodes did this in the 70s. Jim Heinen did this in the 80s, The Star Tribune review of Ann Bauer's book, Forgiveness for You, was headlined Sex Trafficking and Murder in Minnesota, right? So we play to that. We could adjust to and accommodate the littoral agendas, okay? And I think university presses sometimes do that. They'll take the regional, but it's where it overlaps the national. Robert Hedden is editor of Great River Review. I asked for significant younger writers. He says, Edward Bach Lee, Matt Rasmussen, Angela Shannon, quote, writers representing the growing literary multiculturalism in the state. That's the agenda. Bart Sutter added Lynette Rennie Grandel, and in the email says she's queer. That's okay, right? Let's get her in there. Nicole Lee Helget is getting a lot of attention for a memoir that shows Sleepy Eye, Minnesota, where she grew up, as abusive, stupid, homophobic. That's the agenda. And less sensationally, Forrest Peterson is doing a novel, Buffalo Ridge. It's organic agriculture. You go into the current agenda, or maybe you don't have to do that. Louis Jenkins, in a review of Connie Wannock's poems, quote, "They're not about the current hot topics, alcoholism or domestic abuse. The poems don't shout or whine." So maybe we just do that. Maybe just reassert the Midwest as our past. We do historical novels. Dennis Clausen's Prairie Sun, quote, "A faithfully researched, vividly retold piece of fascinating history informed with a suspenseful narrative." So you can do that. We might pitch the Midwest as space and retreat. Thomas Maltman's Little Wolves finds resolution for problems in the amplitudes of the Minnesota prairie. J.J. Lepke's Rich by Accident, get out of the cities, go settle on a farm near Cottonwood, Minnesota. Beth Unis's Leaving Milan, it's Milan, Ohio, not Milan, Minnesota. One of my colleagues says, this is just getting the hell out, right? That's what you do, you go into space. I think that we might conceivably just settle for target a smaller audience, do something kind of simple. You can write the history of the local Minnesota Machinery Museum, and you print 500 copies, and that's okay. You just hallelujah anyway. You go to all the small town festivals, print a little book, you can make it go. You can do something saddle stapled, just interview old farmers. You can make these books for free. Interview old farmers, saddle staple them, they get around. And actually, I brought some books with me. If I take a table full of books to something like Ole and Lena Days or, Southwest, I'll sell $150 worth of books. And over a lot of things that will pay for it. And actually, we have sold more copies of Southwest Minnesota, A Place of Many Places, than Continuum Press, New York and London sold of my Bob Dylan book. So maybe we just kind of settle for that thing, okay? I don't know. I wanted to say something about graphics, and everybody's putting in graphics, and we all look at graphics. I learned about that actually first when I was doing stuff with Vachel Lindsay, who does graphics, and Norbert Bly. And then I did my own book, which I forgot to bring a copy of, Generation in Motion, and they put pictures in there. And people would open up the book, and they would read not a word I said. Look at the pictures, say, oh man, that's a cool book, right? Yeah. So I started carrying a camera and cutting photos into, and I did that for the Jubilee Diary, which is just out in southwest of Minnesota, but you put pictures in there. I did that for the Poland book, and the Poland book is all these pictures taken back in 1989, so they now have historical significance. I did that for the Mongolia book, and I'm getting a little more sophisticated on this as I went to the memoir. I just start cutting the pictures into the text, and then so I think we need to start using visuals and graphics. Sales and distribution, I don't think another small press book distribution system is going to work. A book bus might. I think writers' conferences, as you go to all the little festivals, take the books, take the stuff around. Journals and magazines. The problem with books is that people, they buy books online now, and Amazon.com orders books one book at a time. They take a 55% discount. Publisher does the shipping, it's an absolute disaster, right? Online, that's the big issue. Are we going to publish online? Does that count? It gets the words to the people and the images to the people. How long it lasts, I don't know. I was talking to the head of the Minnesota Historical Society. He says the electrons and digital tend to shift around after about 10 years. So he just plain doesn't trust that stuff. I, of course, like books, but they can get burned, so it doesn't matter. A lot of books start out as blogs and ebooks. Maybe we can open our windows a little bit. Apparently there was a book on the 2011 Chicago mayoral campaign. Started out as tweets and turned out into a book. My daughter knows about that. So I don't know if we can use the past as a guide. That's just some of my ideas, and you younger ones, take it over. Thanks. Bye.
Great. We have almost 15 minutes. This is remarkable because we got through all 4 talks. They were wonderful, each one of them, and we have almost 15 minutes to... It's amazing. You guys, I'm proud of you. So any questions? It's wonderful papers. I was really... anybody? Any questions? We have almost more than 10 minutes. John.
I'll ask a question of Jim. I really, really enjoy all that polka history, etc. My parents still go to the Oost Fest and etc. But it seems to be all kind of dying out. I mean, it doesn't. And in most of the musical culture or the soundscape in the Midwest now seems heavily Southern in terms of country music being Texas-based and Tennessee-based, etc. Is there any way to preserve this or keep it going?
Yeah, it's a tough question, and there are different signs of despair all around, as you mentioned, but there also are signs of hope. I work a lot with creating archival collections of regional music and trying to disseminate the stuff. And in the past 5 or 6 years, I've worked with a lot of younger musicians, some of whom were interested, for example, in old fiddle tunes from the upper Midwest, not Southern tunes. And they got younger musicians to play them. And there was a Minnesota fiddle project that revitalized a whole lot of this stuff. I found some old Scots Gaelic recordings that were sung by a guy in Duluth, and there's a woman in the Twin Cities, Laura McKenzie, who's Scottish American. She's just done a whole CD of 15 songs from this older singer. And so there are things like that going on. I also know of a couple. She comes from a long family of German polka musicians. He comes from a long family of Czech polka musicians. And so they have a band together. They play that repertoire, but they also do Cajun and Tex-Mex and kind of have rock and roll elements. So they're able to do a kind of regionally based fusion that takes in other extra regional kinds of music. There are those sorts of things going on. I'm not sure what sort of effect they'll have, but if one looks around the country, there are different places where younger people have come to the realization that, there's some cultural forms that are in this region that aren't anywhere else. And if we want to think about, where we're based, where we're rooted, let's try to draw upon that. There also are new immigrants who,
Right.
I've done a lot of work over the years with Hmong musicians, and I know some younger Hmong musicians who are blending elements of Hmong traditional music with forms of American popular music to kind of create a regionally based, ethnic hybrid sound. So, there are lots of things going on, but they tend to be going on in sort of small areas. Whether or not they'll get attention and build some momentum kind of remains to be seen. But it's sort of like the movement we're involved with with here, trying to shine a spotlight. There's a lot out there, but it's scattered, and a lot of it is hidden. But there are signs of hope, I would say.
But it seems to me that's really exciting to take the new immigration and see their musical forms, and also I'm not up to date with pop music, but Husker Du, Prince, isn't there kind of regionally based pop music? And
Oh yeah, and of course I
would
didn't
be,
try
you
to
know,
get into that.
right.
There's a lot of really cool stuff. Twin Cities, Detroit, Chicago.
yeah, so it's
Yeah.
very relevant. We could
Yeah.
promote this.
I mean, some of the cooler punkish bands, the Replacements, Violent
Yeah.
Femmes. I sort of feel like there's an egalitarian Midwestern sound to all of that.
There's a wonderful Southern California-based scholar named George Lipsitz, and he brings together, he goes, it's Southern California, but we can do it here.
Yeah.
What George does for California. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah, way in the back.
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear the four of you talk about the role of, and this doesn't come directly out of what you said, only I'd like to take advantage of your thinking about nostalgia and the role of nostalgia. Because I think, I'm persuaded about I'm stumbling. I'm worried in doing Midwestern studies, that we appeal to people for whom nostalgia is so deeply important.
Right.
I want to honor those people's need for that, at the same time that I want to remain critical and alert and kind of incisive. And how do we meander that river bed in doing Midwestern studies?
Yeah, who wants to take that one, right?
Avoiding
I
the
don't
pitfalls
know.
of nostalgia. Yeah, yeah.
Dylan's got a great line, you can always go back, but you can't go back all the way. And I tend to see history as a pendulum that swings back and forth, but sometimes it's just not there, right? It occurs to me that there is one manuscript of Beowulf in the world. There is one copy of Gawain and the Green Knight in the world. What the hell happens? How do you get back to it? What if that had disappeared? But I think you got to go back to primary sources. You go back to photographs. Old photographs don't lie. I spent 2 years in Poland, man. I don't trust anything I hear, anything I see. So, the old stories, I want some hard evidence. I don't know about you guys.
I think obviously that's a real issue. I think Christopher Lasch is one of the people that's thought about that most very deeply, and he, because he's very concerned. He says, "Look, I don't want to be relying on nostalgia." At the same time, he says those who sort of a myth of progress, that whatever is current or whatever comes afterwards is better, is also an illusion, and so one has to work hard to take what is valuable from the past, from tradition, whatever, but to think critically about it, as you say. And there's no, I don't know of any solution to it except to remain critical and thoughtful. And I think that's something that, like in a book, In the True and Only Heaven, Lasch certainly attempted, and I think with much success, suggesting how some of the traditional values that, of course, in a postmodernist world you might think are outmoded, are actually more relevant than maybe the illusions of either postmodernism or of the traditional belief in progress as inevitable, as certain. That's.
Yeah, I think I'm thinking, in 1935, Grant Wood wrote this little treatise called Revolt Against the City. And one of the things he said, even in 1935, was that he worried that regionalism was too much involved in eulogy, saying pretty things, pretty phrases about times and people past, after post-mortem, right? And I agree with you that the challenge is to not be too post-mortem in our studies and in our ethos and in our entire bent. Yeah, I think that you've pegged the question exactly. But Jim?
Yeah, there's a prevailing notion of nostalgia as myopic and departure from reality, but there also is I think a notion of nostalgia that we could call critical nostalgia, that is a critique of contemporary life, and I know to some extent in my own work, in my classes, and in some political stuff I've been involved with, I look, for example, to the formation in Chicago in 1905 of the Industrial Workers of the World, which tried to organize people. It didn't matter, what color you were. It didn't matter what language you were. It didn't matter what gender you were. It didn't matter whether you were religious or not. If you were a worker, you were in it. And in recent years, I've been involved with this Town Gown Labor and Working Class Studies project, and recently we brought up, I can't think of his name right now, but the leader of the Moral Mondays movement in North Carolina, this powerful African-American preacher who fundamentally was calling for people to organize in a way that the IWW was calling for people to organize in 1905. And for my students, a lot of my colleagues, a lot of people I know, they were totally unaware of that earlier movement that cut across all of these lines that tend to divide people. And so some cases I think are longing for a better time is a critique of what's going on now, and by looking at other moments in the past, we can also better understand or see or be supportive of moments in the present to look to the future.
There's a notion called radicalism of tradition. Who's the author of that wonderful phrase? We go to the past to inspire ourselves to a radicalism. It's relevant. The past can be relevant, obviously. We're historians, but this phrase, the radicalism of tradition, I think is very important. I think that's what you're talking about,
yes.
Jim. The Wobblies, we can't exactly replicate them, but we can tell people about them and move forward with that. Robert Nisbet, this great cultural theorist, called nostalgia the rust of memory. And I think we really have to worry about, being stuck in nostalgia, but the idea of a critical nostalgia or the radicalism of tradition or whatever. I think I've got the phrase right, but I think that's so valuable. So if we can link it to the present and move forward somehow.
I'm trying to think of it. Maybe someone knows the word origin of nostalgia. I think it has something to do with
kind of
like
Swiss soldiers who died of it. They actually died.
Yeah,
in the
almost
Vatican,
a sickness of the
Swiss
past.
guards in the Vatican died of this disease, homesickness.
Right, that's right. So it's one thing to think about if we in this room have a past sickness. I don't know. That's the origin.
But
of
it
the
was
word.
a separation from space. Now our nostalgia is separation from time, lost time. So it's switched. It's no longer, we can travel, but we can't go back in time.
Right.
And so it's nostalgia for something we've lost. But obviously we have an important function here. We really do. So, okay, John.
Susan Matt has a new book out on nostalgia, or on homesickness, a history. She does history of emotions, which is this interesting growing field. But she goes into great detail about this as a medical condition.
Right, it was.
In the 19th century, and it was linked to soldiers sent off to wars, and they missed home.
Yeah, Napoleon's troops died in Russia from it. Yeah, it was a malady. Which, it's a wonderful. I think this is perfect. This is great. You guys are great, and thank you. We did it.